Hello everyone and welcome to the program. I am Amarachi Ubani. Valentine's Day weekend saw no exchange of flowers and gifts for world leaders who were deeply engrossed in talks in Munich over the Syria crisis. Remember, the talks were supposed to hold last week but had to be postponed because leaders could not secure a ceasefire. That's one of the conditions given by the Syrian government's main opposition to participate in the talks. Just before the weekend, they were able to agree a ceasefire to allow aid into besieged areas in Syria. Syria is the last country in the Arab Spring yet to witness any calm. It was 5 years ago that young man in Tunisia set himself on fire, starting a revolution that caught very quickly across the Arab world. Though quelled just in time in countries like Saudi Arabia and Bahrain, pockets of violence, however, exist in Yemen. Syria, however, is where the real fighting is. Rebel forces, backed by the coalition forces, have been calling for President Bashar al-Assad to step down. The push has calmed over the last few months, especially with the influx of refugees into Europe, bringing the problem of Syria and the fallout of terrorism squarely at the doorstep of those faced with the dilemma of peace building. Now, later on in the program, we'll turn our focus on the continent. A few elections will be holding this year. And if there is anything the crisis in Burundi has taught us, it is to recognize triggers to a crisis. My guest is the Executive Director of the West African Network for Peace Building, Mr. Chukwemeka Eze. Oh, and let's not forget the U.S. presidential election trail. Following the surprising victories in New Hampshire with Donald Trump winning for the Republicans and Bernie Sanders for the Democrats, focus has shifted to soliciting voters in Nevada and South Carolina. We'll be checking in on the campaigns. But that's Diplomatic Channel in a wrap. We'll be right back. Welcome back. The humanitarian situation in Syria continues to draw attention, with millions leaving on a daily basis out of the country to refugee camps and the more courageous boarding boats across the high seas to Europe. World leaders were able to gather in Munich to discuss the crisis that has engulfed the country for 4 years. The main actors attending the talks were NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg, U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry, the UK Foreign Minister Philip Hammond, and the Iraqi Prime Minister Haider al-Abadi.
Leaders are meeting in Munich for the city's annual security conference. Arriving at the venue is U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry, who had been in marathon talks with Russian and a dozen other countries on a possible ceasefire in Syria, which would help to expand delivery of humanitarian aid. The UN had announced later it would begin delivering aid within 24 hours. Inside the conference, Mr. Kerry accused Russia of hitting legitimate opposition groups and civilians with its bombing campaign in Syria and said it must change its target to respect the ceasefire deal.
Russia's attacks have been against legitimate opposition groups. And to adhere to the agreement that has been made, we think it is critical that Russia's targeting change. And the entire ISSG, including Russia, has agreed to work to make that happen.
Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, who was present at the meeting, said there was need to assess the chances of a ceasefire deal before making any promises. However, Russian Prime Minister said NATO's stance towards Russia was hostile, which could mean they had fallen into a new Cold War, as Russia is blamed on a daily basis for the most terrible threat to NATO as a whole, to Europe, to America, and to other countries. Away from the conference, Syria's National Reconciliation Minister Ali Haddad said the government was being helped by Russian mediators in brokering deals with rebels seeking to lay down their weapons or to relocate to insurgent strongholds. He said communication had begun with groups in Aleppo, a city divided into zones controlled separately by the government and opposition, with a view to concluding local agreements there.
It's been 5 years since Tunisia's President Zine Al Abidine Ben Ali fled his country following an uprising triggered by harsh economic and government policies. The protest caught fire and spread across the North African countries of Egypt, Libya, Morocco, and across the sea into Yemen, Bahrain, and Syria. Has Tunisia been any better since the revolution? A country is said to have become an example of what can happen when a people are ready for a change but don't know how to preserve it. It all began with a slap and an insult at a young vegetable seller in the small Tunisian town of Sidi Bouzid. Residents of the town said anger had been building for years before the young vendor set himself on fire, igniting weeks of protests that eventually led to then-President Ben Ali fleeing the country. Bouazizi died in the early days of January that year, triggering the protests. In a bid to quell the unrest, veteran leader President Zine Al Abidine Ben Ali announced in a television address that he would not seek a sixth term in office. He made sweeping concessions, saying security forces will no longer use live ammunition against protesters and promising freedom of the press and an end to internet censorship. However, determined to see an end to 23 years of repressive rule, Tunisians continued their protests until Ben Ali fled to Saudi Arabia on January 14, 2011. The impact of the Tunisia uprising, whose pictures were uploaded across social media, was seismic throughout the region. Just over a week later, on January 25, anti-government protests publicized on social media websites began across Egypt. Thousands of demonstrators voiced their anger, complaining of poverty and repression in a day of wrath. And in unprecedented scenes, police fought with thousands of Egyptians who defied a government ban to protest against President Hosni Mubarak. On February 1st, more than 1 million people around Egypt took to the streets, calling for an end to Mubarak's 30-year rule. On the 17th day of the protests, Mubarak announced on February 10th that a national dialogue was underway to transfer power to the vice president. But he refused to leave office immediately, as demanded by protesters. However, a day later, Mubarak was forced to step down and a military council was formed to run the country's affairs. The events in Tunisia and Egypt prompted people elsewhere in the region to also rise up against their oppressive leaders. Even in Libya, where protests began in February 2011 against Muammar Gaddafi's 42-year rule. A bloody civil war raged for months until the UN Security Council imposed a no-fly zone on the country and authorized all necessary measures to protect civilians against Gaddafi's rule. On August 21st, rebel fighters entered Tripoli with little resistance and 2 days later made their way into Gaddafi's compound at Bab al-Aziziyah. Gaddafi himself escaped to his hometown Sirte, where after several weeks, as he was trying to flee to the south of the country, he was captured and then killed by Libyan interim government forces, along with his son, Mutassim. The overthrow of Tunisia's Zine Al Abidine Ben Ali shocked the Arab world and shattered the image that its oppressive, army-backed rulers were immune to popular discontent. The Arab Spring that followed saw Egypt's Hosni Mubarak, Libya's Muammar Gaddafi, and Yemen's Ali Abdullah Saleh all deposed. But the Tunisian transition to democracy has been a difficult model to follow, and 5 years after the first protests, much of the region is still beset by conflict, instability and repression. 5 years on, although Tunisia's transition to democracy has been difficult and beset by protests, it still stands as a model for democratic change in a troubled Middle East. When we come back on the program, we're staying with the U.S. elections as presidential hopefuls, at least those still left in the race, woo voters in Nevada and South Carolina. Just stay with us.